Hi, this is Greenwatch, and I'm Hannah Melser. Today we're going to be talking about what is intersex. With me today is Mo Cortez, who is an intersex activist, and Dr. Donna Murphy, who's a physician. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank
So
you.
I'm going to open, thank you. The big question, what is intersex?
So intersex, since most people aren't familiar with what that is, it's whenever someone is born with an anatomical, chromosomal, or hormonal difference that falls somewhere in between what's usually considered typical for being male and female. So what that looks like, it's sometimes someone isn't born with the uterus, or sometimes they're born with a streak ovary or gonad or whatnot. Just the different parts of the human body that can be taken out or changed or I guess mutated. And the frequency of these births are about 1 out of every 200,000. But a new study coming out of Scandinavia saying it's coming out to be 1 out of every 250. So people have heard of hermaphrodite. So like no one is actually born with both sets of genitalia. So which kind of goes to my story. Like when I was born with indeterminate genitals, and the first priority to the doctors at that moment was actually, fortunately, not my genitals. It was actually more about my heart. I was born with a hole in my heart, so that was their biggest priority, was saving my life. That was a life-saving procedure. And the doctors, advised my mother and my father to just raise me as female, which they did till about age 5. And then at that time is whenever someone called my mother into the CPS stating that she was raising a little boy as a girl. So CPS intervened, and I don't have the records per se. I really haven't tried to look for them, to be honest, because it's kind of re-triggering sometimes. But basically, they're basically trying to push my mother to make a choice. Like, I don't know if she went to court or whatever, but so yeah, she was consenting to the surgery. So they took out my testes, and they did a clitorectomy on me. So basically, they took away my body parts without consent. I was just 5 years old. My mother, was a Mexican Mormon epileptic woman, so and also newly divorced because my father had ended up in jail. So it was really stressful for her at that time, and that's why I fight for intersex rights, because I don't want what happened to me to happen to others, and it's really frustrating because I can tell someone about intersex stuff and tell them about the symptoms and the conditions, but it's not until you've actually lived it till you really know. So for example, just common day things that a lot of people take for granted are just some of the negative consequences of these surgeries are bone loss, so osteopenia, osteoporosis for some people. If surgery is done under age 5, there's studies showing that anesthesia will cause damage to the child's brain, so that they'll have learning disabilities and other things, which I'm not well versed. I'm not a doctor, thankfully. So, and other things such as having to take a lifetime of exogenous synthetic hormones. So your body's not able to produce its own hormones. It's not able to create its own homeostasis or its own optimal state. So having that reliance of having to basically rely on that, be dependent upon that, and things such as estrogen for some people, what can cause blood clots or strokes, things like that. And another, I can go on and on with the negative consequences, but I think what really is taken away is just the humanity. I feel like even though a lot of intersex people that have had these similar surgeries, it's I feel like some of us have lost some of our humanity, or at least bodily integrity. I guess that's a better way to say it, and that itself is kind of frustrating, because anytime you try to go on a date, or or people get married and whatnot, you have to, well, some people have to give the disclaimer, oh, before we engage in sexual activities, this would happen to me, and just that disclosure, it's really old, and the stigma, it's kind of overwhelming, and this is just from my own experience. The doctors use shock and awe. They scare the parents into saying, "Oh, your child has cancer. They're gonna die and whatnot unless we operate right away." And that's simply not the case. Simply not the case. No, I personally am not against the surgeries. I'm about basically about health, patient-centered health care, basically. So consent. So.
It's very interesting. You know, you brought up a lot of different topics.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack there. But just kind of to just get to the basics. What's kind of the difference between like your gender identity versus like biological character, like the you know the goods you're born with, to say? What's kind of how are those two things related?
Well, I could say like more like I'll go on the flip side of like a lot of times people think intersex is like trans 2.0, which it's not. Transgender. Whenever someone's transgender, they feel like they're in a certain body and they feel like they need to be in a different body, whether that's the opposite sex or somewhere in between. That's up to them to determine. So with intersex, like I was stating before, people are born with anatomical differences, so it could be basically ambiguous genitalia, or maybe they have streak ovary and a testy, or whatever other combinations there can be. And chromosomal and hormonal. So with intersex people, some of us, like my friend Kuma, he was born with two different sets of chromosomes. He's chimera and intersex, and you know, you really can't define that. Like, how do you define what XY and XO, put together? What is that? So I think what I'm trying to get at is that trans people are basically born typically whatever, so either male or female. So in the intersex world, we call people that are not intersex endosex. So that's a new word for y'all to learn today. So basically, people that are born endosex and feel like their gender should be something else. So it's basically people changing their gender. And intersex, when it comes with gender, like I said earlier, they usually push the parents for surgery, and they usually push to make them female. So they take out whatever gonads they might have and make the bottom, match up to make it look like it's female. So there's that. So it's basically a physical thing.
Okay.
And not to say that trans people don't have a scientific, or a biological thing. They do, right? It's just different. It's just a different thing.
Yeah, it's someone coming from you said
Endosex, yeah.
From an endosex position and wanting to transition from that endosex position to a different endosex position or something in between, where you have the intersex person who's in an intersex position either wants to stay there or transition to one or another endosex.
Well, it's like, I'm assuming you're born in America, so you can't, say you were born in Mexico. You're always born in America because that's just a fact. So, and that's what it is with intersex. Like I myself, I'm intersex and trans, and a lot of intersex people that have had the similar experiences such as I have had don't really associate with being trans. So that's another part of advocates like myself of having to explain intersex and trans. So this is just the bread and butter of the work. So
I mean, thank you for explaining it to us. It seems like there are two kind of concepts that are very closely related, maybe kind of different sides of the same coin in a way, but still distinct in their own right.
Right, and that's actually, yes, thank you for pointing that out. We have legislative and medical concerns in that, like, unlike Dr. Murphy here, we actually have to go out there and find a doctor, and, one doctor, two doctors, three doctors, basically fire several doctors before we get one that actually listens to us to say, hey, this is my body, these are my records, and this is what I need to do to be my optimal self. So there is that. There's that overlap where basically doctors want to tell intersex and trans people, like, no, this is what you should do with your body, or no. So like with trans people, there seems to be extra barriers to say, oh, you want to transition to this gender, well, we got to do these blood labs and whatnot and other things. I guess if people are older, I guess scans or whatnot. But yeah, there are some barriers and issues with the medical community, and even legislation-wise. Like last session in 2017, there was a bathroom bill that they try to pass, SB 6, and that's the one where they say no men and women's restroom, which they're basically being transphobic. So.
But also, I would think intersex phobic too.
Oh, yeah.
Inadvertently or intentionally, you never know.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and Donna was there too. Dr. Murphy was there too, and because when we were testifying in front of the Senate committee, they were stating, oh well, you either have yeah, they're born a man or a woman, blah, blah, blah.
But that's not true.
Well, hey, I'm intersex, I'm here, and
Right.
let you know that some of us are, are born with XY chromosomes and appear female, and if we, according to your law, they're not supposed to go in that restroom, so. So I did tell them that there would be problems, that there would be legal repercussions for them in the future, because at least 2 people have been able to get intersex written down as their sex marker in their birth certificates.
Really?
Yeah. They've actually
In Texas?
not in Texas.
I was thinking.
California, California, New York.
Yeah. Well, good for them. We've kind of talked about it a lot, but it seems like there's kind of like, and I'm going to ask this of Dr. Murphy, 3 kind of different I guess groups of intersex. There seems to be chromosomal, where you're like XXY or you're a chimera, and then there's kind of hormonal, like I think it was androgen sensitivity disorder, and then kind of like insensitivity, and then there's kind of like where the physical characteristics where you've got undescended testes and stuff like that. What are the kind of the differences and commonalities that you see?
That's a good question. I don't actually generally see intersex patients because I'm not an endocrinologist, and I'm also not a surgeon who might have performed surgeries on intersex patients either. I'm a neurologist by training, and so I think a lot about how we construct these categories and how what I guess behaviorally might be different, what neurohormonally might be different between. I guess maybe more on the gender, like talking more about the social construction of gender, like how that happens neurobiologically. But yeah, you're right that the way we think about the diversity among intersex people, we do categorize it in those ways. And I think that there can also be a mixture between those categories as well, right?
You can kind of cross over.
Exactly, right. So you could have a combination of genetic, anatomical, and hormonal differences, right? That don't assign you to one typical sex, right? In the way most people understand sex as being a very dimorphic thing. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. I wanted to add, though, to the conversation about gender and sex, like the way I've understood it, and please correct me if you feel like this is in any way wrong, from my lens as like a scientist and as a physician, and as a historian of science also, who studies and the construction of these categories. I've always understood sex to be about something that is less mutable and that's more detectable, like visually inspectable, right? Yeah. So it's more about anatomy typically, and at birth that's generally how that decision is made. Whether you're male or female has to do with on first pass visual inspection of the anatomy, sexual anatomy, and then gender is something that is not known at birth because it's more of like a psychological and social expression of who you are. And that comes later, right? A baby cannot express those things. But as they get older, they do adopt certain ways of being and certain psychologies also, right? Like depending on what they observe, in terms of like what is considered more female behavior or more male behavior. So that is what distinguishes sex and gender for me. And I think that both of those things are spectral, like they're not binary. But I think a lot of people understand sex to be binary and gender to be more fluid. And there was a time when people even understood gender to be binary. But I think increasingly people are open to the idea that gender is a spectrum. I mean, my children, for instance, will talk about people being non-binary or gender fluid, and those were not in our vocabulary when I was growing up, right? So I think that maybe this will help people to understand that also the category of sex is itself a spectrum. I'm hopeful that that is the case.
I'm in agreement, yeah.
And that's something we used to understand. If you look at ancient cultures, they seem to very much understand that, whether it's the Romans or in ancient Indian cultures, that there was some fluidity in sex, fluidity in gender, and that, it was more talked about and embraced in these ancient cultures as to, more modern culture where it's like, well, you only got to be one of the two. And kind of are hopefully kind of hopefully we aren't going to go totally primitive, but kind of go back to a more broader understanding of sexuality and gender, and that it's not just a binary construct, which I think is very, very limiting, I think, for large segments of our society.
Yeah, and just adding to your point, just from what I noticed and what I've read, and I'm not well read either, I would say that it seems like non-European societies a lot of them seem to have some sort of space for intersex people. It seems like.
Yeah.
Yeah, non-Western cultures.
Yeah.
Yeah, currently there are like many non-Western cultures that have like a third gender category. Yeah.
You even see that reflected in languages, like in Spanish. You have usted. You can have a language that's not just one gender or the other. You can have a society that functions openly to accept other people, which we can always strive for. And kind of to transition to that, I wanted to kind of go over kind of like the history of like the intersex rights movement, and kind of where that started. I know from my own research that the surgery started with a guy named John Money in the 1950s at Hopkins, where he was doing these I believe you call them intersex surgeries to make a child one gender or the other, whatever it was, and not really taking into consideration at all the consequences of what he was doing, and then kind of spread from there.
Right, and his biggest case, or the case that he's most infamous for, known for, are the Joan John case. So twin boys, I'm certain you know this too. Twin boys were born, and one of them had a botched circumcision. So what they said, or I think this took place in Johns Hopkins. So they said, hey, we have a guy here that can make your boy or girl because they don't have their penis anymore. So what ended up happening is basically John Money took the kids under the twins under his wing, and basically did we're all familiar. A lot of us are familiar with gay conversion therapy. Some of this kind of reflects some of that, in that David Reimer is the name of the man that was the victim, of those surgeries. David Reimer basically was kind of encouraged by Dr. Money to act as female as possible and play with female toys, and there's even some controversy, and it's even on record too, that basically Dr. John Money made David and his brother, which his name escapes me now, role play sexual positions, even though these are little kids. So these are little kids that are practicing sexual positions. It's radical, and making David reinforce his gender as female because that's what they said he was, right? So I can see a little bit of the overlap with the gay conversion stuff, with also the anti-trans stuff with this, and that there's a lot of history there.
And all for really what is kind of a societal construction of what it is to be male or be female, or trying to get people to fit into this binary, which you're not going to see in nature. You're not going to see that in a normal functioning population.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know if you felt comfortable telling us a little bit more about your story. You said your mother, when you were first born, you had the heart problem, and your indeterminate sex, and kind of what happened with it sounded kind of like they not kind of gave your mom not the full information about what was going on. You see that that's kind of a common thing that happens?
Yeah. Well, my mom has I think a second grade education. My father had a junior high education, both coming from Latino families, and I think just not having. I think even people with the information still wouldn't have known. I think she was more susceptible to being kind of pushed to do these things because the doctor said so, right?
A doctor said so.
Doctor said so.
Back in the day,
Doctor is God.
Right.
Yeah. And and a big thing they said, they raised David Reimer as a female, and then he finally discovered that what had happened to him in his medical records, that it was a botched circumcision, and he pretty much overnight transitioned to male. I mean, you can't transition a gender overnight, but he decided overnight his true gender. And I guess the reason I bring that up is that that a lot of intersex people, it takes us time to kind of realize, well, first of all, to understand what happened to us, and then to actually kind of go through the records. Like, I had my medical records. They were given to me when I was 18, and I looked at them and I saw a male pseudo-hermaphrodite. I just slammed the thing closed because I was socialized as female, raised as female, and it's pretty scary because you're in this territory where like it doesn't seem real. It doesn't seem real. It's reality that this actually happened to you, and the doctors actually did this, and they thought this at the time, and they still, to an extent, a lot of them still do now. These things are still being done now, from what we have been told.
Do you feel kind of in the medical profession, do you feel like your fellow doctors kind of know what intersex is, or would they be able to interact with that kind of patient, or would they just not kind of know what to do?
I mean, we should know what it is. They teach it in medical school, like that you can be born with, ambiguous genitalia that would not, where it would be difficult to assign a sex, basically, right? Like on that binary. They don't teach you, though, what to do with that. So, and a lot of people will be taking care of these patients for like the same kinds of medical ailments that somebody who does more classically fit into that binary might have, diabetes or like high blood pressure, where it might not be so pertinent that person also happens to be in this category of people, of intersex people. And then there will be people where it is really actually very relevant. And you're not going to know that necessarily as a practitioner because they teach you what it is, but they don't teach you, again, what to do with it, like in practice, like how you best serve those patients. And what like the susceptibilities are also, right? Like, because I think being intersex defies like these social categories that we've constructed. There are a lot of like, just like with the transgender population, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are like mental health issues that people struggle with, depression, anxiety, PTSD, like those kinds of disorders that may be more prevalent among this population. And if you're not taught that, then you're not screening for it, you're not attentive to it. And I think it's important to know that because that's how you best serve your patients. But I don't know, I think it's maybe a function of, at least the perception has always been that it's such a small number of people that they don't necessarily go to great lengths to try to educate you on exactly how to address the issues that are particular to that population. And that's not just true for intersex people, that's going to be for any kind of, I guess, a condition that would put you in a small minority of people. But as Mo mentioned, I mean, this is actually much more widespread than people have previously understood, and that makes sense because like there's so many axes along which you can be intersex, and we don't generally do all those investigations. Like you only like trigger the investigations if the anatomy is ambiguous at birth, right? Or if something is not right in development, right? In like reproductive development as you get older and go through adolescence. So,
and that's actually right. Dr. Murphy has there. Sometimes some of these conditions are later onset. They're not visible right away. Someone might basically have some kind of growth later on in life, in adolescence, or even I think with people with PCOS, and that's that's a condition. What is it? Polycystic
ovarian syndrome. Yeah.
Some people consider that to be intersex condition. Some people don't. So, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think when they get older in life, they're able to basically have kids. Before then, they're not. It's really hard for them to have kids, but until like late 40s or whatever it is. Or
I mean, that condition, there's so many things that contribute to it. So if there are certain circumstances that change, it can improve your odds of being able to reproduce. Yeah.
It seems a lot of these medical interventions, whether it's the surgeries, happen to children at a young age. Is there just a trauma associated with just undergoing surgery, having to be out of school, having these operations done, and I would think as a child not really understanding what's going on?
I would say yes, and especially now since we live in a digital age with social media and cell phones and Facebook. Yeah, like I know some people have had to have surgeries over the course of a summer, so they went their Disneyland trip, they went their family trip, they're not in the pictures and they're not in the photos, and they're having to miss school and having to make up stories with their friends and their church member friends and teachers and whatnot, and just having your business out there. I know when I think in my last year of high school, there's some meeting where really don't remember what it was. I need to look more into this, but for some reason I was there. My biology teacher was there, and I think maybe a social worker was there, and the school counselor was there, and they're talking about like, oh, your surgeries went well, you're well adjusted, whatnot, and you had a big clitoris, and now it's gone, blah blah blah. This is just, said out in plain, So my biology teacher, got really red. She looked at me and right out of the room. So, which I don't blame her, but
Should
I
make you
wasn't.
feel really good about things.
I wasn't expecting this, as a teenager. Like what,
Because everybody when
this
they're
is out there.
feels so good about themselves when they're in your teenage state. You really feel great about your body image.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, there seems to be a lot of that, and seems to be a lot of people who the surgery happens to them when they're a kid, and they don't really know. The parents will be, oh, you had a urinary tract issue, and we had to take it to the doctor.
Or hernia. Yeah.
Or hernia, or something like that. And then it's later that they find out, when they turn 18 and get their medical records, or even later, that this has all gone on.
Wow.
And I forgot what it was called. It was I think his name is Jimmy Kimmel. Is a talk show host. He said he had a collapse. Something. What does that man have?
I don't know, Jimmy Kimmel.
Like not urethra, I don't know. I forgot what it was. He had some kind of collapse. So I think he said he had like hypospadias. That's what it was. Yeah. So he had some kind of issue with that, and hypospadias is an intersex condition too, to an extent, if it affects other things. So I just think that a lot of people have intersex conditions and may not know that, or may not understand that.
Yeah, and they think, oh, I've just got a hormonal thing that's weird.
Or a random scar, surgical scar. And an issue with which, that's very rare, in that a lot of times whenever they do these surgeries on intersex kids, it's not just one surgery. Sometimes the scar tissue tears, so later on in life they might have to do it again and again and again. So they get pretty expensive very soon. And like, for example, in my case, I don't know how much my surgery cost, but I'm certain it wasn't $10. So right, my mom I think she was making $10 an hour at that time in the 80s, and her health insurance would not cover that, or it was too expensive basically. So the state of Texas actually had to pay for the surgery. So what I'm saying are that these surgeries are basically being subsidized by the government. So even our state to be paid for it, to be done, and for what. A lot of people don't like them. They don't like the results of the surgeries, and also they're life altering. They're very life altering, and they're not really urgent.
Yeah.
It may be a social emergency. The doctors might be treating the parents as patients instead of the patient as a patient. That might be, what's happening. But
Surgery is really for the parent to feel better. They want to, what I hear a lot is. Or often said is like, we need to do this surgery because your kid's going to get cancer from this unattended testy. Like, what are there actual risks involved that need surgery, or is this kind of seems to be, at least from the research on it, a common theme ploy where they'll to induce parents to have their children have surgery, which what parent wouldn't?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I would say it's a couple things. One, with the surgeries, they're about the same. From what I've I've gone to workshops, and they kind of broken this down really well. I'm not good at retention though, so but basically the percentages are pretty much average. So like for intersex people, so if a man has this percentage of having cancer for this, like for the testes, like it's the same as anyone else. So we don't automatically take out breasts because they could possibly have cancer, right?
Yeah.
Or brain or heart, because you don't. So yeah, and also I would say with these surgeries that a common phrase that I've heard around not really doctor circles, but other people I've heard are it's easier to make a hole than a pole. So That's why they usually push for making them female, because they can create this. I know. Actually, I was here. I'm from West Texas. I'm from San Angelo. Yeah, it's wild. It's morbid and it's scary and it's funny at the same time.
Such as
But I'm from West Texas, and I came here one summer when I was 12 years old to see a doctor in the medical center, and he wanted to create they create like a surface vagina, but then they wanted to create a viable vagina. So a viable vagina is one where it can be penetrated by a penis. So my doctor said, "Oh, well, you want to go out and get a vagina so that whenever you in the future you have a husband and you can have sex and all this."
Very heteronormative.
Yeah,
Very,
yeah. And-
that's going to be your main concern is like husband.
Yeah, exactly. A 12-year-old sex
Right.
life, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was very hesitant. I pretty much shut down. I didn't say anything. I just, he's like, we'll just wait till you get older. We'll wait till high school. We'll come back and revisit this. So thankfully, he saw my hesitation, as a teenager, and to let me be. And that's one thing I'm glad about that doctor that he did. I really hope he's still alive. He was really old when I was 12, so he may not be here. But
It's good thing you didn't do that. But I think it's interesting where it's like the whole importance of the surgery. This really, I would think, very intrusive, dramatic. It was so some man who may or may not have sex with you later may or may not be happy. Like that was the whole. Not you,
yeah,
really.
my happiness, the man's happiness. So
But just the possible man's happiness. Not even, like, it's just
imaginary
so
men,
absurd.
imaginary men matter more, don't they?
Don't they really?
It seems like it.
Oh my goodness.
Which kind of reminds me now that you talked about med school. They have a couple things. I would say there isn't enough research done on intersex people that follows the long-term effects of it. So like longitudinal studies.
Longitudinal, yeah.
Yeah, there haven't been barely even a handful of those done. So they know that there's something wrong with these surgeries. Or I would assume that, in my opinion, that it's one thing that scientists do. They have a hypothesis and they test it, right, and they look along the whole thing of the experiment, whatever. And that hasn't been done, and it needs to be done. Just do the science, really. Just do the science, due diligence.
I was thinking about some of the things with the kind of the unwanted surgeries and kind of from what it's been described to me, sounds like kind of doctors just experimenting, kind of playing God with people's gender, people's sex, and it kind of reminded me of parallels with like the Tuskegee experiments and Henrietta Lacks and the forced sterilization of women, where we had these recurrent themes of a combination of medical authority and governmental authority going into people's, private areas, whether it's, sterilization or this woman's Henrietta Lacks cells or, studying these men with syphilis. And it seems like a constant thing we keep going over in our society that, where a government medical complex kind of takes over and says, this is what you need to be. We need to study for this. And, we need to find out this. And it doesn't really matter what the human cost is.
Oh yeah, definitely. And since you said hospital, I'll say this now since I'll remember it. This past, I think last month in July, myself along with other intersex advocates, about maybe 70 of us, we basically did a protest at Larry's Hospital in Chicago, and we had an installation of all these like a giant tarp with a bunch of baby diapers with blood on them to symbolize the surgeries that are happening there. And the same protest was done, but with 3 people or less people, about maybe almost a year ago. And the nurses were asking the protesters, like, what is this about? What's going on? That installation wasn't there, but they had signs. They said, oh, these intersex surgeries are happening. Like, what do you mean they're not happening? They're not happening here. This is Lurie. It's not happening here. And they still are. They're still happening. And it's kind of scary that people, even within the same exact hospital where these surgeries are happening, don't know about it. So that tells you the level of I wouldn't say, I guess, ignorance, a level of just secrecy, I guess. Yeah.
There seems to be a lot of secrecy that surrounds it.
Shame and secrecy.
And I think that could almost be as traumatizing or more traumatizing than whatever medical condition you had or were born with or whatever it was. Like that would seem to be small fries in comparison to the huge stigma and the trauma from that.
Right. And a lot of intersex people, I'll speak for myself here, and that those of us born with indeterminate, genitals, we really don't know that unless someone tells us, like a parent or a friend or whatever. But like I really realized something was different about my body, or wrong, I should say, wrong with my body, wrong. When I was 5, I woke up in a hospital bed in Dallas, and there was, a gigantic, like, just, it looked like an X when I was little. So basically, where they had done the clitorectomy, there was a giant red X. There was scar tissue. So something that I had previously, I was 5 years old, so I knew a lot by then, more than Donald Trump, right?
You knew your body.
Right? But yeah, I realized, wow, something was wrong with my body, so much so that they had to intervene and take it away from me. So
Yeah.
we don't, and that's the thing, that intersex bodies are normal and they're beautiful, and they're just different. They're not like others, and that's just how it is. Everyone's different.
It's like you having long earlobes or short earlobes, except our society's decided to just focus on this. Like, how big is your clitoris? Because it's gotta be in this little range, and if it's out of it, oh no.
Oh yeah, and actually building on that, they actually intersex protesters from the first one, they developed like a ruler. It looked like it's called the phallometer. It's basically a symbolic rule of what, like, if it's over,
Right.
if the child's genitals are over this range, there's like 3 ranges. There's female, there's cut, there's surgery, and then there's male, right? So I don't remember if it's 1 centimeter or 1 inch. I don't remember right now, but if it's under that threshold, basically it's female. If it's over that threshold, it's male. So since my body wasn't too responsive to testosterone, and it was easier for them to make a hole than a pole, they said, oh well, you literally don't measure up. So they brought me down. So yeah.
That is crazy. And such life-altering decisions made so early in a person's life.
Yeah.
How have you grown into your identity? How did you make that?
I don't think we have enough time for that. We don't have enough time for that. But I would say, I was brought up in a traditional Mexican Mormon household, a single-parent household. So I guess it's not too traditional. But a lot of it was really focused on my growing up was really about the focus of my mother's care. Like, she would have seizures, and like she would be able to tell me ahead of time that she would, like, a seizure was coming or something. So she would just sit down and kind of just sit there and, like, kind of, I guess,
Try let
throw up
pass.
or whatever. Yeah. And I was more worried about my own mother's health and to be concerned about my own, and that's really what it was. So it wasn't maybe till 18 till I thought, well, all right, I'm done with high school. Let me check out what's in these records. I looked at the records, shut them, right away, and packed up and moved to Houston. So I'm here now. And that was about 15 years ago, and pretty much just, I would say, my first 10 years in Houston here were basically kind of just trying to reconcile, like, okay, I'm a lesbian female, but this I'm different and blah blah blah, but I don't really feel like a female. I don't really feel this way, and I think about maybe 4 years ago, I finally thought, well, this is who I am. It's scary, having to transition, and I started the transition about maybe 4 years ago. So.
Wow. Was it very hard, like, on your family? Were you able to?
Yeah, actually, I kept it from my family. I lived with my sister at the time for about maybe 9 months. And then, slowly, my voice is changing and everything. My body reacts slowly to testosterone, so I had time. And I finally said, hey, I guess I'm transgender, like, and I'm like, okay, all right, well, cool with that. We'll ask, it's my niece, I think she was 12 then, or whatever, or young, a little, and they're like, well, all right, well, we don't know what to tell her yet. So I'm like, well, kids usually understand things, are more accepting, or more
You
able
get
to
things
grasp.
quicker.
Yeah, and she got it right away. She's like, oh yeah, like like no duh, there's no duh.
Okay, whatever.
Like, you're not Thea, you're Theo. So
Are we still gonna go to Whataburger? Let's move on from this.
exactly. So yeah.
Out of the mouth of babes.
Yeah.
And thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
I wanted to talk about kind of some of the advocacy you've been involved with. That you talked about. You recently got a Senate bill to committee, Texas Senate Bill 1342. Can you tell us more about that?
So basically, I think at the end of December, myself and Kuma, he's the other openly intersex person in Houston. That's well known. Just kind of brainstorm. We're like, what can we do next to help advance the movement or help protect children? And we thought, well, policy. And so I went to I think there was some kind of political event, and there was Senator Garcia was there, Sarah Davis, and someone else was there. And I asked the legislators, at that community town hall, hey, would you be interested in supporting an intersex protection bill, and how to break that down? And Silva Garcia said, oh, I'll take a look. And basically from there, about maybe a few weeks later, along with Kuma, myself, and Interact Advocates, they're an intersex advocacy agency they're basically the only one in the States that has attorneys on hand specifically just to work with intersex cases, and all together formulated model legislation, and it finally became a bill, SB 1342, in March, the first week of March. And about a week later, our fellow activists in Nevada followed suit and also introduced their own bill too. And I spoke to a bunch of legislators, Republican and Democrats, and they were all very supportive of the bill. The only people I've actually seen kind of against the bill were actually Democrats, and
Really?
they're Democrat people of color too, politicians of color.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I won't say their names because I'll reach out to them again, and maybe they've understood more now. but yeah.
Do you think it's just kind of maybe a
It's
cultural
unbelievable, yeah.
thing where sometimes you'll see this where in whatever minority culture it is, if they'll be accepting of some things and then just completely not accepting of other things, and it's kind of maybe.
I think the biggest beef I heard from one of them. The other one, I think they're pretty much about parental rights. That's what their biggest concern was, about parental rights. So, which that does matter, but it's not the parent's body, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I can see kind of. I think I can see where the crux of what they're coming from. If you've been a group whose parental rights have systematically been taken away by the government over hundreds of years, I can see why you would,
Want to trust the medical community.
Yeah, you really wouldn't.
Right.
It's kind of maybe historical trust and just not understanding
And
kind of what's going on.
I'm thinking that's what it probably is now that you say it. So I can see that now.
Just real quick, because I should have asked you this earlier, Dr. Murphy.
Sure, yeah.
But how did you get involved in all this?
Well, through Mo, explicitly through Mo. For a long time, for many years, I've had great interest in like how it is in medicine and in science we create these categories that are really meant. I think we intend to serve the people that we're categorizing, but also at some level we're doing it to study people, and that's one way to study. I mean, to break things down to make something a more tractable problem, I guess, right, to solve. You assign things to categories, and then you can try to understand the differences between those categories. It was interesting, like listening to Mo talking about like your personal experience of being told. I mean, I was appalled, but being told by that physician that this decision about whether you were going to get this surgery had to do ultimately with whether you would be like an appropriate receptacle for the family.
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, that's so appalling to me. But then when I think about the categories that we create for sex in medicine and in science, I think ultimately it's to understand reproduction, which is kind of the same thing, right? Like ultimately there are human beings who elect not to reproduce, and that's totally valid. But we, in science and in medicine, we are trying to understand reproduction. So that's why I think ultimately we have created and we perpetuate these categories, is to understand that. Which, you know, that's legitimate for people who want to reproduce. But I think that ultimately the categories that we create, when they, at the individual level, are, what's the word for it? Like, they're deleterious, right? They cause harm to the patient by like insisting that they fall into one of these categories, then there's something that we have to challenge there about those categories. And so yeah, my interest was really kind of an intellectual interest in like how it is that we do this. I mean, it has to do with like the history of science, the history of kind of ideas, the history of the professionalization of medicine, and like, yeah, so yeah, I had kind of like an academic intellectual interest in it, but it wasn't until Mo that I really saw like there was great need to actually be more visible about how what we're doing is not serving people, you know. And I totally agree with you on all levels, not just for the intersex community, but I think that patient-centered health is definitely where we should be. It shouldn't be about what somebody on the outside says, you know, imposes upon you, like, as, you know, this is the norm, and you should do, we need to do whatever we can to ensure that you conform to that norm. It should be about that patient being educated and making their own choices about what they want for themselves, you know, and how they see themselves in this case, right? So, yeah.
I really kind of like what you said, where it's, you know, the categorization is really good for like scientific research, but it can be horribly dehumanizing to the patient.
Yes.
So there's a good and a bad side, but you gotta keep the categories maybe to more of a research, trying to figure out, or teaching mode, and then more of a, you know, this is a person.
Right.
You know, they might just be fine, happy as a clam as they are, just because they don't fit in your neat box of what, you know, humans supposed to be.
Right.
Doesn't mean they need all this other stuff.
Yeah. I'm encouraged because like now you know, because of technology, we're able to understand things that are much more complex with things like machine learning, where you can have like data that has like a lot of different variables. And the more data you collect, like the more the algorithms understand about what's going on. So you don't have to just have these binary categories, right? You can have, you know, somebody in seemingly their own category, because along these multiple axes, they're different things, right? And you might not have a name for that. But there may be other people who are similar and different, you know, and with enough input, I think you can understand what's going on with the diversity of people that there are. So that's encouraging. I think prior to that technology being available, it's hard for a human being to interpret data that has so many variables.
And just so vast,
Right.
too. It would take people decades to get through one patient or something like that.
Exactly. So, yeah, so I'm encouraged that that will allow us to understand more, like with the biological diversity that we do have, what is going on with people insofar as it affects their health and well-being, right? Because again, I don't think there's any reason to like categorize people just for kicks, like, you know, and but if it is something that is done because it helps that person ultimately, right? Then I think that that's a worthwhile endeavor. So, yeah. I'm encouraged that we have now the technology to head in that direction, to not have to be so reliant upon these binary categories. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Do you think there's kind of a lot, both socially we can do and in the medical field, to kind of move forward on intersex rights, and just I would just say generally just more awareness. I think if people were aware of how common it is and how honestly non-life-threatening it is, because it seems with the vast cases of intersex people, they're pretty much just like everybody else. You know, there's not really at higher risk for things, or, you know, of course you can also have some conditions that can be very detrimental to people's health, but, you know, it seems like most of the time you wouldn't know them from Joe Bob, your neighbor.
Right.
Yeah. And one thing I was going to say with medicine too, I'm going to do a good medicine thing and a bad medicine thing. So a good medicine thing, I know women with androgen insensitivity syndrome, and also with Swyer syndrome, which I'm not familiar with that one, so I won't speak you know, into detail with that. But both types of people with those conditions have been able to get uterine transplants, right?
Really?
So and have successful births. Now, I went to a reproductive research conference maybe about it in January, and they had information about lesbian couples and gay couples, but in regards to trans people or to intersex, well, intersex wasn't even on there, and trans. It wasn't on there either, but at least they had some kind of idea to understand what trans was. So that's why I was there to speak to them about intersex things and say, hey, intersex people want to have kids, want to have kids or bear children too. AIS women are born with testes, so theoretically you could move those testes somewhere else in the body, or they could
Tuck them under an
space.
armpit
Exactly,
or something.
that's actually one of the things the doctors have said, and that you could put it under an armpit per se, and they could have fathered their own children later on in life or whatever. Which there hasn't been enough research on that, and there probably won't unless someone has a fortune to spend on that.
Unless there's some money to be made on that.
Exactly, and exactly.
If only we can make a $500 pill for it, then we'd have the cure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Or not cure, you'd have something. You'd have something. There'd be a little commercial where a little happy pill would pop up and be like, are you upset?
Right. And so with all of that in mind, so kind of bouncing back to policy, so Sylvia Garcia, the state senator, now she's running for, I think she's running for the Congress now, and some other people too, right? They're running for Congress too, and her and about a few other people, even Sri Preston Kulkarni. I tried to reach out to Ted Cruz. He hasn't reached out to me.
You're not the only one.
Yeah. And we just recently heard from Beto that he does support intersex people's rights. So that's really good and promising. So so basically now we're working with these candidates now to basically formulate model legislation now, so that in the near future we're able to hopefully eventually introduce a bill in the U.S. Congress.
Wow.
So this is...
they really need to get on that, because I think those surgeries are just absurd. You got to do something. And speaking of which, you were talking about your Texas Senate Bill 1342. It was also going to impact foster care children, because there's intersex children who are in foster care, and kind of things can kind of get a little off the rails.
And it's actually just for children in under state care. I guess that'd be foster care. So yeah, it's just for foster children. But the idea is to basically kind of use that as a model, so that you can use non-governmental patients and treat them this way too, so that they can be able to have priorities to say, hey, when I'm 12 years old, I'll be able to make a decision. I'll have an attorney who is familiar with intersex people, intersex cases, intersex history, and medicine, and whatnot, and and a doctor, won't make the decision for me. I'll be the one to make the decision if I want to do anything at all. So,
That's right. If you had, in our kind of remaining minutes, if you had one message, I'm going to ask each of you, like to give to an intersex person or an intersex kid, what would be your message to them?
That that you're not alone. There's other intersex people out there that are living happy lives. Unaltered. Some people are unaltered, and even the people that are altered, like myself, we find, reconcile. We find a way, just to just work with it or deal with it, and that it's possible to have a life without having someone to control you. I guess, yeah. And I would say, go out to resources like there's AISDST.org. They're a national group that it's the Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome Disorders of Sexual Development Organization. It's they're still using the old nomenclature. We kind of stick with intersex now, but they do that for Google searches, so people are able to find, oh, my medical records say DSD.
They don't say intersex. Yeah.
What's intersex? So that's kind of what their mindset is. And here locally, and we're the only known organization here in Texas that's known, the Houston Intersex Society, which it's composed of myself and Kuma, which we pretty much do educational support now, and we go out to hospitals. I've done even standardized patient testing over here in Baylor too, and kind of just reach out to anybody and everybody who will basically have their ear. So from judges to attorneys to show hosts, I'll speak for anybody. So.
So do you get out their earlobe and measure it and make sure it's within the certain degree of how long you do it?
Right. Exactly.
So funny.
Dr. Murphy?
I think that I would say that that we're that we're all different, and that difference is strength. I would really want to not just talk to the kids, but to talk to their parents, because I think it's so crucial that parents are bought into that same idea. There's this really great book called what is it? It's about a tree. Like the title has to do with the
The
tree.
Giving Tree?
No. It's a very thick book.
Okay, never mind.
Okay, well,
Say
I
that.
haven't read that book.
I don't remember the name now. The title is escaping me. But it's actually about children who are different, like in a lot of different ways, but predominantly that they're different from their own parents, and their parents don't understand their experience, and often that can be a source of great conflict and pain for the parent and for the child. I would recommend that book very strongly to the parents. And just emphasize to them that really, I mean, I view it as like something beautiful. Like it's like biological diversity to me is beautiful. And I think that if you can get the parents and the children understanding this in that way, that it's all going to be okay. Like ultimately it will. And like we're here as physicians to support you. If you don't have a physician that does support that position, that this should be about ultimately the kids' decision making, right, as they get older, and that the parents should be there to support them, and that the medical establishment should be there to support the family, that you should be looking elsewhere if your physician is not supporting you that way. Yeah, so, yeah.
Sound advice. Yeah, and that's one thing I forgot. Parents need support. They're scared, so they need support. Yeah. Totally agree.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we focus a lot on the kids and the intersex people themselves, but I can only imagine what it would be like to be a parent and you have this brand new baby and to get this, your baby's intersex. What does that mean? Is something wrong with my kid? Like all that comes in a very emotional moment of your kid, and a lot of emotions involved there. A lot of very intense feelings.
Overwhelming.
Yeah. Oh, the book is Far from the Tree.
Far from the Tree.
There you go.
Yes. And there is a great poem that speaks to this as well. It's by Emily Pearl Kingsley, I think is the name, and it is called Welcome to Holland. And actually, I was introduced to this by an amazing woman surgeon at Texas Children's Hospital, and she has a child with Down syndrome, and the poem is really the premise of the poem is like being told all your life that like Italy is this amazing place to visit, and that you spend your whole life dreaming of going there, preparing to go there. You buy all of the books, like the travel books, the guides, you plan when you're going to go, what it's going to be like, what you're going to be doing. And then when it's time to go, you get on this plane and it takes off and they say, you're not going there.
Oh no.
Going to Holland, right? And how devastating that can be when your expectation was that you would be going to this particular place that you had always dreamed of going. And that's kind of what, she parallels her experience as the parent, expecting that this is going to be who your child is, and then getting something that you did not anticipate. But
Which
then,
happens always.
Yes, it does. It does. But then she talks about landing in this place where there are fields of gorgeous tulips and all of these things, and that is a very beautiful thing ultimately. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. And real quick before we wrap, I'd like to say October 26th is National Intersex Day. Nice. Come celebrate it however you like. And October 25th is the Houston
Intersex Awareness Day.
Houston Intersex Awareness Day. Thank you so much. I'm Hannah Meltzer, Dr. Murphy, Mo Cortez. This has been Green Watch. It's your world. Take care of it.
With power, here they come, international loan sharks, backed by the guns of market-hungry military profiteers, whose word is a swamp and whose brow is smeared with the blood of the poor. its quality, who render rage a necessity.